In my last lecture, I argued that rather than through a single sweeping visionary gesture, comics developed in the 1970s through an awkward and multifaceted process of experimentation. One critical year in this process was 1986, the year in which three major extended comic books came to market: Art Spiegelman's Mouse, Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, and Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen. I know of no other moment so defining in literary history, no other year so singular in its overarching influence, and so I term this the 1986 trifecta. In horse racing, a trifecta is a bet in which a person predicts the final order of finish, first, second, and third places. But more generally, a trifecta is a threefold win. 1986 was just such a win for comic book readers. Three books that changed comic history came out, and these will organize our investigations for the next 3 weeks. Mouse will focus us on literary autobiography. The Dark Knight Returns will return us to genre. And Watchmen will bring us to, for lack of a better term, media. For this week, my thesis has been that comics have something to teach us about literature. Mouse teaches us about representation. The first thing it teaches us is to read books. This lecture will investigate how Mouse came to be a book. The next lecture will explore what Mouse has to say about the book as a powerful technology for representing the self. For books unify the self in a way that is psychologically appealing, but that is perhaps not necessarily psychologically true. In short, I suggest that we are divided within ourselves. Books represent us as whole. Art Spiegelman is an American artist. In 1986, he published Mouse, Volume 1, My Father Bleeds History. In 1991, he followed this with Mouse, Volume 2, and Here My Troubles Began. In 1992, he received the Pulitzer Prize Special Award for Mouse, a significant award usually reserved for literature and the highest literary prize ever bestowed on a comic book. Spiegelman started out in 1966 drawing and designing wacky packs. Wacky packs were stickers distributed like baseball cards, 3, 4, or 5 or so, packed together in a little wrapper with a stale stick of gum and sold down at the local newsstand. Wacky packs parodied, in the great EC and Mad Magazine tradition, common household products: Grave Train for Gravy Train dog food, Skimpy, crummy bean nut putter made from old peanut shells for Skippy peanut butter, and so forth. After reading Jack Kerouac's On the Road, Spiegelman set out for the West Coast, moving from New York to San Francisco, where he began writing and drawing underground comics. As we have seen, in 1975, he teamed with Bill Griffith to edit Arcade, the Comics Review. And here's the cover at issue 3, drawn by R. Crumb and featuring a beautiful fall evening in the city. This, to me, is sheer poetry, and I have to agree. Arcade did not last long, only a few years, and in 1977 Spiegelman married Françoise Mollet. In 1978 they came out with Raw magazine. Raw followed out the Arcade project, but upped the stakes. The cover announces its originality in a number of ways, showing us a sophisticated, urbane reader perusing the very issue that we hold in our hands and announcing that it is not a comics with an X, but a graphics, the graphics magazine of postponed suicides. Handmade, oversized, and with hand-laid color, and a special mini-comic sewn into it, its physical presentation paralleled its intellectual statement. Over the course of his career, Spiegelman went on to publish In the Shadow of No Towers in 2004 and Breakdowns in 2008. Breakdowns is actually a reprint of a 1977 collection of his underground work, with a new comics format autobiography. But it is worth pausing to recognize that shortly after winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1992, Art Spiegelman became a contributing artist at The New Yorker magazine. The New Yorker is one of the top literary magazines in America for the general reader. It has long featured cartoons of wit and satire in its pages, and since its beginning it has featured a special illustrated cover. Here is the first, featuring the New Yorker icon Eustace Tilley by Rhea Irvin. Under its general editor, Tina Brown, in 1993, Françoise Mollet became the art editor of The New Yorker, and as a contributing artist, Spiegelman drew a number of covers. Here is his cover to the 1993 St. Valentine's Day issue. Titled The Kiss, the cover answers the recent race riots between Jewish and black people in the Crown Heights section of New York City by showing a Hasidic man and a West Indian woman kissing. It inspired some controversy. Here's his 9/11 cover, a cover that appears upon first glance to be entirely black and only reveals the ghosts of the 2 World Trade Center towers when the light hits it in a certain way. This brings me to my point. Throughout comics history, comics have been deemed fraudulent, puerile, dangerous. This is an issue of authority. Art Spiegelman reversed this situation, achieving literary recognition and bringing his sense of comics, a sense derived from the underground comics of the 70s, but also refined and developed into something new, graphics, to American literary culture. Thus, if comics derive authority from literary culture, Spiegelman turned this around to change that culture, installing a new comic sensibility into the heart of literary culture itself, The New Yorker. How did this come to pass? In part, it came to pass through the sheer power of Spiegelman's storytelling, for Maus is a powerful story. It is a story of the Holocaust. It is a story of immigrants and of the memory of the old world. And it is a story of community, about how a community turned on itself and how individuals were both abandoned by their community and developed new communities in order to survive. It is also a story of artistic maturity, of reading comic forms and of drawing them out as something new. I suggest 2 major influences on Art Spiegelman. First, Justin Green's Binky Brown meets the Holy Virgin Mary. The first page of Binky Brown sets out a poem of inspiration and guilt. The title, Once Upon a Time, begins the comic by returning us to the past. In the first tier, Green shows us Binky playing with a ball. The tier sets up a rhythm, each panel illustrating the beat of the bat hitting the ball. The last one misses the beat, however, and sends the ball down the stairs. The middle tier gives us 2 larger panels, compressing the individual steps the ball takes into 2 main actions. The first marks the progression down the stairs, bonk, bonk, bonk. And the next, the tighter panel, gives us the closing action. The ball inevitably and unavoidably hits the statue of the Virgin Mary. How could it be otherwise? The last panel opens up the page to sum up the catastrophe. Sweet Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, you've destroyed the Madonna. I'm really, really sorry, Mom. So Binky Browns opens with the literal action of iconoclasm. Iconoclasm means the breaking of religious statues, but the action here is also literary. Justin Green is announcing that his trespass against the Virgin Mary has inspired a smashing of the limitations of comics. It gives us exactly the confessional energy Green promised us in his prologue. Spiegelman tells us that he visited Green's apartment. I first saw the large-scale pages that became Binky Brown meets the Holy Virgin Mary flapping from a clothesline that hung above Justin's drawing table and seemed to stretch all around his living room. Those pages hanging above the drawing table and throughout the living room and the smashing of the Virgin Mary suggest a new energy, an opening up in which the pages themselves both breathe the visual and intellectual mission that Green sets out, and also flutter in the air with a kind of energy and opening outward of what the comic's form can be. During the same time, Green and Spiegelman were invited to contribute to a comic anthology edited by Terry Zwigoff and entitled Funny Aminals. The name Funny Aminals echoes a long-standing comics genre that we've seen before in George Herriman's Crazy Cat. The undisputed comics master of funny animals throughout the 1950s and 1960s was Carl Barks, and it's worth pausing to look at what he could do in this genre of funny animals. Barks started by working for Walt Disney. In 1942, he moved from Disney to Dell Comics and began anonymously illustrating Donald Duck comics, and then inventing the world Duckburg and the anti-hero Uncle Scrooge. Barks was so successful that though he was anonymous, readers requested his special touch over all other artists. Let's look at one of his pages. Now, the first thing that catches my eye in this page is the copyright material at the bottom of the page. Walt Disney's Comics and Stories, Volume 17, Number 7, April 1957. This places the comic only shortly after the Comics Code Authority was created. Below that, the page announces in bold blue letters, Dell Comics are good comics. And this should remind us that Dell, one of the largest, if not the largest comics company at the time, did not seek the Comics Code Authority seal. It stood on its reputation alone. Beginning the story, the first tier sets the scene in three ways. First, it gives us a title, Walt Disney's Donald Duck. Then, it gives us a little panel inserted in. One of life's little joys is explaining the stars to the wondering minds of children. And then, the tier itself announces the page. It sets out the Duck family silhouetted by the light of the city and staring up to the light of the stars.
Uncle Donald, what is that bright star just setting in the west?
That isn't a star, boys. That's Jupiter, the biggest of the planets.
Tier 2 focuses in, first moving us closer to the family, who are still silhouetted.
How big is Jupiter?
Plenty. It's much bigger than the Earth, as an orange is bigger than a pea.
Golly, do you suppose people live on Jupiter?
And then, in the next panel, the scene lights up with the illumination of Uncle Donald's answer.
Hardly, but they'd be whoppers, about 11 times taller than Earth people.
Is that all the difference there'd be in them? Just size?
In the first panel of the third tier, the ducklings give their own wisdom, and so they are cast in light. But the light is not hyperbolic, and so the setting of the panel gives them a kind of wisdom.
Yes, where's your imagination, Uncle Donald? Couldn't you picture them as having 12 eyes and 16 arms? And scaly skins like the slithery creatures we saw in the movie last week?
And in the last tier, the duckling's wisdom, a far greater wisdom than Uncle Donald's, is set against his.
I don't dig that scaly creature stuff. I like to imagine life on the stars as being like ours, only bigger, much bigger.
How dull. Golly, Uncle Donald.
You have a very common imagination. Strangely, the two main characters in this panel are now framed against a brick wall which apparently has come out of nowhere. And so they march along as if into the comic book pages, the grid that lies ahead of them. Thus, the page gives us a little poem on the wondering minds of children. In this poem, the imagination plays a significant role, and it suggests that children have a powerful sense of imagination that adults, in fact, lack. It suggests that children are active readers, that they don't just respond passively to whatever adults feed them, but that they think through the wonders before them. Dell comics are good comics. This page achieves its meaning through a light-hearted approach, through the careful balance of color, and through the inoffensive questioning of adult authority. So Barks says of his funny animals, "They happen to be humans who look like ducks." But I would advance the description of the genre to say that funny animals is a genre of comics for imagining another voice speaking to us from our books. It is a genre about our own desire to imagine the mute animal, the unknowable, as recognizable, a version of ourself. Now, Zuigoff's Funny Animals was to be a sort of animal rights comic, but as soon as R. Crumb did the cover, it became an underground comic statement. Here Crumb illustrates two hep cats in zoot suits, actually little kitty cats, eyeing a chick, actually a tremendous chicken. Spiegelman initially planned to do a story on the Ku Klux Klan, but as his plans developed, he turned to a Holocaust story of cats and mice. Funny Animals facilitates Spiegel's theme because it provides a genre that's aimed at explaining the unknowable, in this case, the unknowable horrors of the Holocaust. My point is that Mouse, for all its genius, and it is genius, develops as a story from the literary scene of San Francisco and the genres available to Art Spiegelman at the time. It took its impulse from what the artists were doing, and it advanced them. Mouse became a book through Raw magazine. Raw 1 included a short miniature color comic by Spiegelman entitled Two-Fisted Painters. For issue 3, titled at the bottom of its cover, The Graphic Magazine for Damned Intellectuals, Spiegelman included something more ambitious. He included Mouse. Here, attached to the back cover, was, in miniature, the first issue of A Survivor's Tale. The caption explained that this was just the beginning. This is the first part of a projected 200 to 250 page work in progress. Future chapters will appear in Raw on an occasional basis as they are completed. Opening this little comic, we find a picture of Spiegelman under Auschwitz's infamous gate. The first appearance of Mouse gives us the comic as an intimate artifact. It gives us a promise, an ambitious promise, that there are hundreds of pages to come, and it gives us Spiegelman right there at the spot of the history he will tell. Opening up the 1986 edition of Mouse, we find something entirely different, the copyright page of a published book. Reading this is a much different experience, for here, launching the story, are the words of Adolf Hitler. The Jews are undoubtedly a race, but they are not human. The lines begin Mouse by asking, what if we took them seriously and cast the Jews as mice? Then perhaps the Germans would be cats. So the lines give us a conceit. A conceit is an extended metaphor. So the lines appear both the literal impetus of the story and an ironic proposition. Irony is a powerful trope, a powerful figure of speech that turns language around. It comes from the Greek for purposeful ignorance, and here we are being purposefully ignorant, imagining that Hitler's proposition is true, but the truth of irony is that it means exactly the opposite of what it says, that the Jews are of course human, and so are the Germans, but the notion of what happened is so impossible that we need irony, we need animals, funny little animals, to understand it. If we read on in the copyright page, we find that instead of funny animals, very real people are involved. Ken and Flo Jacobs, Ernie Gere, Paul Pavel, Louis Fili, and Stephen Heller. And a little further down, we find that Mala Spiegelman and Françoise Mollet are involved as well. But if we search these acknowledgments, one person is missing. The person the whole book is about, Art Spiegelman's father, Vladek. Indeed, The link between the notion of fatherhood is complicated because when Spiegelman talks about the book, he mentions paternity. I'm called the father of the modern graphic novel. If that's true, I want a blood test. Graphic novel sounds more respectable, but I prefer comics because it credits the medium. Comics is a dumb word, but that's what they are. Thus, in a strange way, identity, personhood, is wrapped up with the book on a number of levels. In its use of animals for people, in the relationship between the telling of Vladek Spiegelman's story and the recognition of him, and in the origins of the graphic novel. Yet the copyright page has more to tell us, for if we read on, we see that Vladek's name finally does appear under the Library of Congress cataloging information as to what the book really is. Library of Congress cataloging and publication data. Spiegelman, art. Mouse, A Survivor's Tale. 1. My Father Bleeds History. 1. Spiegelman, Vladek, comic books, strips, etc. 2. Holocaust, Jewish, 1939 to 1945, Poland, biography, comic books, strips, etc. 3. Holocaust, survivors, United States, biographer, comic books, strips, etc. 4. Spiegelman, art, comic book, strips, etc. 5. Children of Holocaust survivors, United States, biography, comic book, strips, etc. Interestingly, the New York Times originally put Mouse under the category of best-selling fiction. Spiegelman wrote in and asked them to change it to nonfiction. So Vladek appears in the book as a descriptor of the book. And oddly, though this is only one book, the copyright page tells us it actually has many birthdays. 1973, 1980, 1981, 1982, 1983, 1984, 1985, 1986. Indeed, your version may have more yet. It bears these different copyright dates because it was printed as separate comics in raw and in various comic book anthologies. It only became unified when it became a single book and was given a single ISBN number. Thus, at a very basic level, Mouse asks us to think about how books represent people, how they unify the many moments of a person's life into one story. Mouse does this brilliantly, but when we look at it closely, we see that it reveals to us that there is not one moment of origins, one birth, but in fact, many. And so, before we even begin the story, we have learned to read a truth about people and books alike. They are composed of many different fragments.